Massimo Bottura became one of the most celebrated chefs in the world, while a lot of Italians thought he was ruining Italian cuisine. Because in a country where cuisine is treated almost like religion, Massimo started taking apart the classics: lasagna without structure, parmigiano transformed into foam and air, tortellini served with almost no filling at all. And somehow, the more controversial his food became, the more the world fell in love with it, until eventually a tiny restaurant in Modena became the #1 restaurant on earth. But what makes Bottura important isn't just that he made Italian food modern, it's that he managed to do something almost nobody thought possible. He convinced fine dining that emotion, memory, art, imperfection, and storytelling could matter just as much as the food. And in a cuisine built on tradition, that was incredibly dangerous territory. Because unlike chefs who tried to escape their culture, Bottura challenged Italy by obsessing over it. This is the legacy of Massimo Bottura. If you're into stories like this, about chefs, restaurants, and the art of cooking great food, subscribe to the channel for more. And if you enjoyed the video, leaving a like really helps more than you think.
Does the legacy hold up? We chef.
Most revolutionary chefs try to invent something completely new. Massimo Bottura did something much harder. He tried to reinvent one of the most emotionally protected cuisines on earth. Because Italian food can look deceptively simple, until you realize how fiercely people protect it. French cuisine historically rewards reinterpretation. Japanese cuisine rewards mastery and repetition. Even Nordic cuisine eventually embraced experimentation almost as part of its identity. But Italian cuisine is different, because Italian food is deeply tied to memory, family, religion, tradition. And that creates a very strange challenge for chefs. Because when a cuisine becomes this deeply guarded, innovation stops feeling neutral. It starts feeling personal. Which means Bottura wasn't just competing against other chefs, he was competing against nostalgia itself. And somehow, instead of rejecting the past, he turned memory into the foundation of his cooking. And that's why his food feels different from most modernist chefs. Ferran Adrià often asked, "What can food become?" While Bottura asked something much more emotional. What does food remember? Meaning, what emotions, memories, childhood experiences, family rituals, and cultural identity can food carry with it? Because for Bottura, dishes weren't just recipes, they were emotional artifacts. And once you understand that, the whole career starts making more sense. But the real crazy part is, the same country that would eventually celebrate Bottura as a national icon almost rejected him completely in the beginning. Massimo Bottura was born in Modena, Italy in 1962, which if you care about food, is kind of like being born inside sacred ground. This is Emilia-Romagna. Parmigiano Reggiano, prosciutto di Parma, aceto balsamico tradicionale, tortellini. Some of the most protected culinary traditions in the world come from here. Protected legally too. DOP certifications, regional regulations, multi-generational production rules, entire systems built around preserving authenticity. And Bottura, he grew up surrounded by all of it. His grandmother's cooking, his mother making pasta, family lunches stretching for hours. Which becomes important later, because Bottura's food never really stops being about childhood memory. Even when it becomes abstract, even when it becomes conceptual, even when it becomes internationally famous. Underneath everything, it's still Emilia-Romagna. But what makes Bottura unusual early on is that he wasn't only obsessed with food, he loved contemporary art, jazz, fashion, philosophy, culture in general, which eventually becomes one of the defining traits of his cooking. Because Bottura doesn't really cook like a craftsman, he cooks more like a curator. And that difference eventually leads him in direct conflict with traditional Italian cuisine itself. Unlike a lot of famous chefs, Bottura didn't come out of the classic French brigade pipeline. He briefly studied law before abandoning it to pursue cooking full-time. And early on, he worked in and around small traditional kitchens near Modena, including Trattoria del Campazzo, which matters because it's where Bottura first learned what Emilian cooking actually looks like when it's done at scale. Not romanticized home cooking, not memory, but repetition, inside a working kitchen. Service after service, night after night. Orders coming in, tickets piling up, timing everything down to seconds. Cooking tagliatelle al ragu in constant motion. Rolling tortellini by hand for service after service. Slowly simmering a proper ragu for hours until it becomes something stable enough to repeat every single day. That's a different kind of education, because cooking pasta at home with your grandmother is one thing. Doing it under pressure, for paying guests, while everything is happening all at once, is something else entirely. That's where rhythm gets built, not inspiration, repetition, structure, and respect for regional identity at scale. And that foundation never really leaves Bottura. Even when his food becomes more conceptual later on, it still has that Emilian backbone underneath it. Later, Bottura gets exposure to classical French haute cuisine at Alain Ducasque's Louis XV in Monaco, where precision, refinement, and hierarchy define every movement in the kitchen. It's a very different language than Emilia-Romagna, but it sharpens his understanding of structure at the highest level. And what Bottura takes from this period isn't imitation, it's discipline. The ability to execute ideas cleanly, consistently, and at scale. Because a lot of chefs can imagine dishes, much fewer can run them every night at the highest levels of pressure. And that distinction becomes important later on, because Bottura doesn't just become a chef who creates ideas, he becomes a chef who can actually build systems around them. And that combination, emotional instinct plus operational discipline, is what sets up everything that comes next. Because at this point, Bottura is still learning the rules. The moment he starts bending them hasn't happened yet. In 1995, Bottura opened Osteria Francescana in Modena, and at first, people hated it. Seriously, local Italians thought he was disrespecting tradition. Some critics didn't fully understand what he was doing, and in Modena, a city deeply protected of its food culture, inside Emilia-Romagna, one of the most traditionally bound culinary regions in the world, there wasn't exactly much excitement about deconstructed lasagna. But Bottura kept pushing anyways, because he wasn't trying to destroy Italian cuisine, he was trying to examine it emotionally. And that's where his food starts separating itself from almost everyone else in fine dining. A lot of chefs build dishes around technique, precision, ingredients, heat control, sauce work, balancing flavor. Bottura builds dishes around narrative. Oops, I dropped the lemon tart. The crunchy part of lasagna. The 5 ages of Parmigiano Reggiano. These aren't just plates of food, they're stories, memories, ideas, sometimes even humor. And gradually, the world starts paying attention. Michelin stars arrive, international press explodes. Chefs begin studying what he's doing. Because Bottura found a way to make Italian food intellectual without stripping away its soul. And that balance is incredibly difficult to maintain. But at this point, Bottura is still only a fragment of the story he will eventually tell. Because even though Osteria Francescana is starting to gain attention, the philosophy behind it is still evolving. And that evolution accelerates when another influence enters the picture, Ferran Adrià. In 2000, Ferran Adrià invited Bottura to spend time at El Bulli. And much like Grant Axe, whose legacy you can find on my page, once Adrià enters the story, everything starts shifting. Because up until this point, Bottura has already been pushing Italian cuisine toward narrative and emotion. But Adrià represents something different entirely. Not reinterpretation, but reinvention. And what Bottura sees at El Bulli doesn't replace what he believes in, it expands it. Because Adrià isn't just asking how food should taste, he's asking what food can physically become. And the idea hits Bottura at exactly the right moment. Because suddenly, Italian cuisine doesn't feel like something that has to stay fixed in time. It feels like something that can evolve. Not by abandoning tradition, but by reinterpreting it. Which sounds simple now, but at the time, it was deeply controversial. Especially in Italy, where food is tied to identity, memory, and cultural authority. Because changing a recipe there doesn't feel like innovation, it feels like disrespect. And Bottura is about to find himself right in the middle of that tension. And honestly, this might be the most important part of Bottura's legacy, because Italian cuisine is deceptively difficult at the highest level. French fine dining historically evolved around complexity, luxury, sauces, and technical hierarchy. Italian cuisine evolved around restraint, simplicity, ingredient quality, and regional identity, which creates a very specific challenge for chefs, because when a cuisine is built on memory and tradition, innovation doesn't feel neutral, It feels disruptive. And in Italy, that disruption gets personal fast. Too modern, people reject it as disrespectful. Too traditional, the global fine dining world stops paying attention. So the real question Bottura had to solve wasn't just, how do you modernize Italian food? It was, how can you evolve it without breaking the emotional connection people have to it in the first place? And that's where his approach becomes really different. Because Bottura never tried to separate Italian cuisine from its history. He tried to reinterpret the feeling of it. And once that idea starts working, it didn't stay contained to one restaurant in Modena for very long, because suddenly chefs everywhere started realizing something. If tradition can evolve emotionally instead of literally, what else can fine dining change too? And that question is exactly what pushes Bottura from respected chef into one of the most influential figures in global fine dining. Then comes the rise that turns Bottura from respected chef into global culinary icon. Osteria Francescana climbs higher and higher on the 50 World's Best list. And eventually, in 2016, it reaches number 1. Then again in 2018, which is a massive moment for Italian fine dining. Because historically, Italy produced legendary food culture, but not always dominant modern fine dining institutions on the global stage. Bottura changed that. Suddenly, Italy wasn't just the home of tradition, it was producing one of the most influential contemporary restaurants on earth. And unlike some avant-garde chefs whose work feels calculated or clinical, Bottura stayed emotional, human, warm, funny, chaotic, which made him unusually accessible for a chef operating at this level. He didn't feel like a scientist, he felt like an artist who happened to cook. But while Bottura was becoming one of the most recognizable chefs in the world, he was also starting to ask a much bigger question about what fine dining was actually supposed to do for society in the first place. Then, Bottura's legacy expands way beyond Osteria Francescana. There's Gucci Osteria, Casa Maria Luigia, along with international collaborations. But maybe the most important project is Food for Soul, which Bottura and his wife Laura Gilmore created to fight food waste and food insecurity. And this is where another side of Bottura becomes really clear, because unlike chefs obsessed with only luxury, Bottura became increasingly focused on responsibility. Refrettos around the world transformed surplus food into meals served with dignity. Not charity disguised as publicity, actual systems built around respect. And that matters, because Bottura's career arrives during a moment when fine dining starts getting questioned more aggressively. Is luxury cuisine disconnected from reality? Wasteful, elitist, outdated? Bottura responded by trying to connect fine dining to social impact instead of separating them.
I think the answer of Feed the Planet, first of all, fight the waste. The example for me would be like build something in which all the best chefs in the world, they will come and show what we can do with an overripe banana, an ugly tomato, or some breadcrumbs. I went very deep into my memories, and I remember that one of the most delicious dinner I could have when I was a kid was a warm cup of milk with some breadcrumbs, a little bit of sugar, and a light touch of chocolate.
And that gives his legacy a very different shape from most elite chefs. Because now he wasn't just influencing what chefs cooked, he was influencing what chefs believed their responsibility actually was. And once that shift starts happening, the influence spreads way beyond his own restaurants. And then there's the influence itself, because Bottura's impact isn't just visible in chefs who worked for him, it's visible in how modern fine dining talks about memory, emotion, imperfection, storytelling, and cultural identity. His chef tree spreads across modern fine dining, luxury hospitality, and contemporary Italian cuisine. But honestly, Bottura's bigger influence is philosophical. He helped normalize the idea that fine dining could be emotionally vulnerable, that food could reference childhood, mistakes, music, politics, humor, even anxiety. And that separates him from chefs focused primarily on technical dominance. Because Bottura rarely feels interested in proving he's the smartest person in the room. He wants you to feel something first. And that's why His dishes often become more meaningful once you understand the story, memory, or emotional reference behind them, which is why some critics don't connect with his food. Because if the emotional narrative misses you, the dish can suddenly feel overly conceptual. And that tension follows Bottura his entire career. But honestly, that's true of almost every chef who permanently changes the direction of fine dining. Because once chefs start building cuisine around ideas instead of just flavor, the debate stops being about food alone. And like every massively influential chef, Bottura's career also comes with criticism. Some people think his food leans too conceptual, too dependent on storytelling, too intellectual. Others argue that restaurants like Osteria Francescana represent a version of fine dining increasingly disconnected from everyday diners. Then, there's the broader criticism aimed at the world's 50 best ecosystem itself. Questions about media influence, culinary politics, global trend cycles, the way certain styles dominate certain eras until the industry collectively moves on to the next idea. And Bottura inevitably becomes tied to all of that because he rose to the absolute top during the peak power years of the list. Back when the world's 50 best wasn't just recognizing restaurants, it was actively shaping the direction of global fine dining culture. And at that time, restaurants that reached number 1 could still remain on the rankings afterwards, continuing to dominate attention and visibility for years, which made the top of the list feel less like a constantly resetting competition and more like an evolving hall of global culinary icons. But truthfully, those criticisms almost reinforced Bottura's importance, for 2 reasons. First, reaching the top of the list, twice at that time, was incredibly challenging. You were actually going up against the best of the best, at a time when the top regularly featured restaurants like Noma, El Cellar da Can Roca, 11 Madison Park, and Murazar. And secondly, because nobody debates chefs this intensely unless they've actually changed something. Safe chefs rarely become this polarizing. And so like what is Massimo Bottura's actual legacy? It's not just that he made Osteria Francescana famous. It's not just that he reached number 1 in the world, twice. It's that he proved fine dining could be intellectual without becoming emotionally cold. That innovation and nostalgia didn't have to be enemies. That modern cuisine could feel deeply personal. And in a country as insanely protective of food as Italy, that's incredibly difficult to pull off. Because Massimo Bottura didn't abandon tradition. He argued with it, played with it, challenged it, loved it enough to risk upsetting people over it. And that's probably why his work lasts. Because underneath all the concepts, all the awards, all the global recognition, the food still feels human. But Bottura's story also sits inside a much bigger shift in modern cooking. The moment chefs stopped refining cuisine and started rebuilding it from the ground up. The moment technique became experimentation. The moment science enters the kitchen. And restaurants started asking not just how food should taste, but what food could physically become. And if Bottura shaped how chefs thought about memory and emotion on the plate, the next chef reshaped the entire language of modern cuisine itself. Because next up on Chef's Legacies, Ferran, Adrià. Thanks for watching, and if there's a chef whose story and legacy deserves to be told, leave them in the comments below.